you very much for your great presentations. I guess I will start with the end of the table and the latest presentation, Brianna and Cynthia. Do you think that the preservation state, the conservation state, or the finishing that was applied to the photo might skew? Hello?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll rephrase my question. Do you think, how much do you think the conservation state or the finishing, for example, mounting on something might skew the data that you might be able to be collecting from prints?
So there were only a few instances where we had like a flush mounted print like Tess came across. But we actually acquired another micrometer that can measure for thickness of prints that are mounted with a border to a mount. So we were able to measure the thickness for the majority of our prints, even if they were mounted, with the exception of flush mounting, though maybe I can go back and utilize Tessa's protocol. But yeah, I would be very interested, and Cynthia and I have talked about going back and revisiting the prints that, especially the Modati prints, the puppet prints, and looking at those compared with the portrait of Tony Lujan more closely, and seeing, because they did share a lot of affinities, also oddly in terms of color, which they kind of seem to be going different directions, as one is developing this silver mirroring, the other one is kind of getting that inherently warmer, more brown color. So it would be interesting to kind of go back and revisit those and look at them as a group again.
Sorry. Yeah, I think Brianna's covered a lot, and as the conservator, you're much more familiar with a lot of the conservation issues here. I'm going to second what she said, and then in addition to kind of the studies that we kind of went over in this presentation, there were other examples. For there's a print of like a raven or a crow, a bird that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it wasn't presented here, but there was a print of Alvarez Bravo's. It was a raven. It showed kind of skewed data really kind of universally in all sectors, color, gloss, texture, and thickness, or
I think
maybe
just like color,
but mostly color. And when Cappy and Cynthia came to CCP to look at all of the Alvarez Bravo prints and go over them individually, we did note that that particular print, that raven print, was starting to develop this really faint orange discoloration kind of globally. So probably from like improper processing or not thoroughly washing out. So it wasn't evident when I was going through it, just kind of quickly and kind of taking cursory measurements, but they flagged it, and I was able to go back and kind of find that discoloration. Yeah.
Thank you. Tess, as opposed to the two other presentations, you look at the entire career of a photographer and went through, which can be daunting, but yet you were able to extract some meaningful results from all the data. Do you have any tip for someone that would want to embark on an entire career of an artist on how to get overwhelmed by the data?
Yeah, I mean, so my ability to do that was very fortunate given the collection that we had. Like, if the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation hadn't given that very encyclopedic, very comprehensive gift to the Guggenheim, it obviously wouldn't have happened. I was also in the privileged position of being a fellow who was funded by the foundation, so I had the time to focus on this research, as well as doing other things, but I was really there to do this characterization. Golly, yeah, I think it was definitely, I worked on it for 2 years. It was definitely very daunting to collect so much data in that amount of time, and working with Lens Media Lab was tremendous and amazing to have these partners in analysis and guiding the data and even the thickness measurements. I measured them all with a micrometer before I realized that that was absolutely useless. And Paul and Cynthia came up with the alternative approach, which was wonderful and successful. So, yeah.
Time. And yes. Finally, Katie and Nora, you're at the beginning of looking at the Man Ray data that you've collected. What question are you hoping you'll be able to answer once you get through all the data? Is there a specific question that you have in mind that you think this will help?
Yeah, I mean, we should both address this, I think, but one of the things we had thought at the start was that we would find some connection between subject matter and the type of paper. And I do think that in some cases he was choosing specific papers, but it honestly, from the results thus far, which are limited, it doesn't seem like there is that correlation that you might find with other artists. And it's really great to see all these other projects and how they're different, how they're the same.
I think I would say, is this loud enough? I think I would say, just in addition to that, it feels already like we're sitting on a sizable amount of data that just still doesn't feel like enough. It's like we're dogs on a short leash or something. Like we're trying to get to something that we can kind of see through a cloudy window, something that might be interesting or promising, but without a little bit more data, I think it's hard and probably a bit dangerous to draw concrete conclusions. And so I think that if we had the time of a fellow, for example. If we're able to dedicate more time to a project like this and to go around and collect more data, visit more collections, maybe even return to the collections we've visited thus far, and really try to crowdsource even more data on Man Ray's body of work, I think it could get more and more powerful. I think with what we have right now, there's also just a lot of time and effort needed for us to just sit and look at papers and start doing some sort of in-depth research with all of those springboards that everybody talked about, right? Like there's so many avenues of research that are now apparent and worthwhile. So there's a lot to dig into.
And I do think even with the data we've collected so far, I mean, I'm sure everyone in the audience this morning when they were watching Damon, and he was showing one thing, and then he was showing another, and I was getting really excited. And then he kept going, and then, I was starting to get a little overwhelmed. But it's true that these apps are really extraordinary tools, and you can keep going and going and going. And even with the data we haven't explored the depths that the app can offer us, I don't think, yet.
Right, yeah.
But again, it always has to be combined with other work. The two curators are doing this incredible work looking at correspondence and finding actual references to papers. That's golden, and you have to keep doing that as well.
Okay, I have a question. Thank you, everybody. I was so interested in when Paul was showing us the original results he had gotten, comparing his own visual inspection to what the data showed later on. I was especially interested about the Weston and Modati and Lola Alvarez Bravo material. In your visual inspections, did you see things that were different from what the clusters revealed? Was your visual inspection, did it contradict the data?
So I think initially when I was going through them on my own, yeah, I think I expected there, like especially going through Lola Alvarez Bravo's entire archive, there were certainly series of prints that we expected to cluster together. That in the end, I know we didn't go into it here, but that was our initially, the project was just Lola at the beginning. And there were clusters of prints that we expected to be together that in the end were not. And so it was actually a great opportunity when Kathy and Cynthia came to look at all of them. We were able to bring out all 171 prints and look at them side by side in their individual clusters. And we could see similarities, but it didn't mean that we didn't expect some of those photographs with similar imagery to be together. Like I certainly thought that all of those Hagemeyer portraits would be in the same cluster, but yeah, there are surprises for sure. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I have only seen the Alvarez Bravo prints in person, so I can't comment on the Midati or the Weston. But for example, and I know we didn't go into like the groups of clusters, or all of the groups of clusters where, for example, they were only Alvarez Bravo or only Midati. But if you looked at, for example, some of the ones that cluster that are only Alvarez Bravo, there's a group that's the set of portraits that were kind of interesting that I think you could see they were more like expressive papers. And then there are a couple of series of portraits among her works that you can see are sort of like a series that would from the same session, and some of those would cluster together. So there are cases when, yeah, it would match with kind of what you might expect. But then as Brianna has said, for some other examples, we found that sometimes our data will tell us some interesting new things that'll ask us to go back to the collection and take a closer look.
Thank you, everyone, for those talks. I have a question, please, for Nora and Katie. I'm wondering, because Man Ray's been written about so extensively and, in fact, wrote about himself, did you find anything in the data or in your research that contradicted the stories that have been told?
I think there are a lot of contradictory theories. So, I mean, I can't speak directly to contradictions. I'm having trouble thinking of a contradiction to something that Man Ray said about himself. Honestly, so far, I feel like the data that we've gotten from the photographs that we've measured, by and large, didn't sort of go along with his statement about caring less about the aesthetics of the prints. But there have been researchers over time who have made claims about him using sunlight, for example, or moving light sources. And it's, I mean, there's lots to learn about whether that's possible. And I mean, we're particularly intrigued by the notion of him using a paper with, you know, lower sensitivity, like a gaslight paper, for example. So we don't know if that's true, and the data isn't really revealing that as like a silver bullet of any kind. But that's a particular question that's, I think, still nagging at us, for sure. But I wouldn't say, there hasn't been a lot of consistency in what people say about his working practices, I think.
Yeah. I mean, you could even say, you know, that he talked about sort of inventing the photogram. You know, of course he didn't. Like, you know, Talbot was maybe he wasn't the one of the free, but you know, it had been around in photographic history for a long time, and there are accounts of, you know, school children, that was like a thing that you did. You made these photograms. He was, one could argue, using them slightly differently. But again, I think, you know, when an artist is reflecting back on their own work, of course they have the license to paint it in whatever way they choose. So, you know, there is a bit of that, which I don't hold against him. He's got the right. Did that help?
Hi, I have two questions. I'm going to try to be brief. I have one for Nora and Katie, which kind of follows up on what you were saying a little bit about Man Ray. Man Ray is the Salvador Dali of photography, I would say, in terms of don't believe anything he says. But I have a question about specifically Les Champs de Lucieux and the additioning of the rayograms, which were obviously made after countertypes. And I was curious about whether you have tried or has anyone tried to do comparisons across the editions of Les Champs de Lucieux in terms of the mass production of the portraits for that portfolio? That's my first question. And then I have a question next for Tess about the very obvious, you talked about the printers, and this, as an art historian, for me, I think one of the things we try to counter, although no one believes it, is the concept of authorship in photography and the neglect that has been given, particularly in post-war photography, to the printers, to the commercialization of photographic printing. And I was wondering if it weren't time to really get on the record and interview the extant printers of fine art photography today, and also to kind of negate the fact that, to what do we attribute Mapplethorpe? How much does he have to really do with these printing? How much is done by the printers? So I want to start with Man Ray about that, and then come back to the larger issue of what are we seeing in a print and who should be credited with the printing and with the photograph at that point. So thank you.
I actually do not have an answer for you, but I think there are other individuals in this audience who might. And I'm actually looking for Leanne.
Oh, she is. Yeah.
Do you want to address that?
Wait for the mic.
Hi, Ann. So your question was about whether or not people have been looking at the different prints in the editions of the Champs. And I can't answer that. I think it would be a really worthwhile project, but we did look at the one at MoMA when we were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the publication of that print. And those prints are all, they're contact prints from a negative. So yeah, that would be the thing. I think some of the differences, there may be some paper differences between each of the images in that portfolio, but also each is trimmed, and so one could look at that. But they're one-to-one, they're contact prints. So the...
Right, but I was just curious about across all the copies of Les Champs de Lucieux, if anyone's compared the different...
Not that I know of.
Not yet.
You'd have to get them all together, or you'd have to send Paul out there to look, do all the measurements.
So to speak to the second question, which is an absolutely excellent question and something I think about all the time. So in the case of Mapplethorpe, he was very much a perfectionist and very exacting, and he was incredibly involved during the printing process. So he was often choosing papers, very, very closely and meticulously overseeing proofing. In the case of some of his later photogravures that he made with Graphic Studio, some parts were hand painted, and he would stand over the shoulder of the person doing the painting and watch and make sure they were doing it to his standards. So he was very, very involved in printing, even though he wasn't doing the printing. Paul and Jeffrey did, during that pilot study, interview Sal Lopes and Martin Axon about their work and their process and their printing techniques. This project is ongoing, and I'm hoping in the future we'll be able to identify, with the help of the foundation, who made what prints in our collection, and be able to interview all of these people and really understand their practice and their process and their influence. Because every print, especially if you're working with commercial printers, you have the paper, and then you have the printer, and then you have the artist, and it's this kind of trifecta that creates the final object. And they're all very important to what that object is. So it's definitely something I think we should be thinking about and looking at for anyone who isn't doing their own printing, which is many, if not most, contemporary artists now aren't doing their own printing. So.
And I'm sorry, everyone, I know there are more questions, but we are a little bit over already. So maybe you can continue the conversation over the break. We'll take about 15 minutes, and then we'll be back at 3:40 for the start of the next panel. Thank you.